next session is session 4, Resistance Against Leaders. Jackson Reinhardt is an independent scholar, podcast host, and freelance writer specializing in biblical theology. Not only has he published in a variety of peer-reviewed publications in patristics, biblical studies, and religious history, but he has been a longtime ally of SASA and was a former intern for the organization. The title of his paper is That Ye May Be Able to Stand Against the Wiles of the Devil, Divine Vicegerency and the Armor of God in Ephesians. So I will end my screen share, and Dr. Reinhardt, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Megan. Just one clarification. I'm sadly not yet a doctor, but maybe in the future.
My apologies.
No problem. It's no problem. So thank you so much for SASA for hosting this conference. Last year was absolutely fantastic, and the presenters this year have been even more extraordinary. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I will begin. The epistle to the Ephesians has a troubled legacy within both majority position historical criticism and imperial biblical criticism, the latter hermeneutic being the investigation of Rome's critical influence on the writing and thought world of the New Testament authors. In historical criticism, there is a now universal consensus that Ephesians is not the work of Paul of Tarsus, but from the hands of a later author writing within a post-Pauline or even anti-Pauline tradition. While this paper is not the place to review such arguments, this authorial position has led many scholars to argue that Ephesians lacks not only the theological tropes of a genuine Pauline letter, those being Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Galatians, Philemon, and Philippians, but also the radical egalitarian outlook of Paul himself. To Richard Horsley, the true Paul has been submerged in, quote, deliberative narratives, songs, and proclamations have been overlaid by domesticating disciples, end quote. Marcus Borg and J.D. Crossan go even further, identifying the Deutero-Pauline tradition in Ephesians, Colossians, and the pastorals as the work of an anti-Paul. Indeed, this characterization is not without warrant. The political orientation of epistles like Ephesians is decidedly more accommodating, if not supportive, to the structures and systems of oppressive imperial power embodied in 1st century CE Rome than the apostle who, by subverting the motto of Pax Romana, wrote that those proclaiming peace and security will face sudden destruction during Christ's apocalyptic return, and that is 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Typically, the evidence scholars utilize in demarcating Ephesians as imperial accommodationist literature is the hierarchical and patriarchal household codes in Ephesians 5:22-6-9, which outlines how members of the pater familias are to behave in regards to one another, children to parents, wives to husbands, slaves to masters. However, in this paper, I argue that Ephesians accommodates the presuppositions and propaganda of Roman imperialism in that by clothing Christ in the language of royal ideology and equipping early Jesus believers in the spiritual armor of God, the epistle simultaneously denudes the imminent and deeply political eschatology of authentic Pauline Christianity and places present opposition to the gospel firmly in the supernatural realm. I will look to both ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman political theology to see the intellectual and literary antecedents to the concepts featured and apply to Christ and the early Jesus believers within the epistle. Greco-Roman and Hebraic literature frequently portrays the political role of the king-emperor as the vice-regent of God and or the gods. This characterization was a core tenet of Roman imperial theology. Caesar was the earthly representative of divine rule. Official and unofficial histories, inscriptions, and political miscellanea from the 1st and 2nd century CE claim the occupant in the role of Caesar was designated by, quote, the supreme god Jupiter Zeus to be vice-regent or agent to rule humans on the earth, end quote. The imperial cult of Domitian, 81-96 CE, forcefully promoted the notion that, quote, Jupiter protects Domitian as he carries out the task, manifesting Jupiter's presence, reign, and blessings for the well-being of subjects, end quote. Even the erudite Stoic philosopher Seneca, in his letter on clemency, declared Nero, quote, out of all mankind has been chosen and thought fit to perform the office of a god on earth, end quote. The same thinking is replete in the Jewish tradition. Psalm 110:1 presents Yahweh imploring an unnamed king of Judah to become his vice-regent, quote, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, end quote. The Second Temple document, the Psalms of Solomon, features the same conceptual language as both Roman and Old Testament theology. The Spirit of Yahweh fills this Davidic, messianic, ideal king, and designating that the elect monarch will, quote, rule over Israel in the time which God chose, destroy the unrighteous rulers, and cleanse Jerusalem from the Gentiles who trample her to destruction, end quote. When the proper divinely elected king is enthroned, there will be, consequently, a cosmo-terrestrial epoch of unending peace. As per Julian Smith, in both political and theological traditions of Greece, Rome, and early Judaism, quote, the ideal state of humanity, the ideal state of peace and harmony and virtue is enjoyed when God rules through his human agent, the king, end quote. In Ephesians, the author analogously employs this political theological rhetoric and applies it to the cosmic role of Christ after the resurrection. Christ has now been enthroned at the right hand of God the Father, Ephesians 1:20, placed, quote, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion. He has put all things under his feet and has made him the head over all things for the church, end quote, Ephesians 1:22, 21, 22. In the epistle, Christ is thus the ideal chosen king, acting from his enthroned position in the heavenly places, having ushered in an era of cosmic reconciliation and harmony. Christ has reconciled humanity with the Godhead, Ephesians 2:4-7, and destroyed the separation between Jew and Greek. Quote, for he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down hostility between us, end quote, Ephesians 2:14. Christ also establishes concord within the universal church and individual household, Ephesians 4:16, 5:22-6:9. Like Domitian, Ephesians depicts Jesus' function as, quote, the agent of God's blessing to the church, the ultimate aim of which is nothing less than the restoration of divine harmony to the cosmos, end quote. Christ has all but defeated, in essence, the powers and principalities now under his feet, through his crucifixion and resurrection. Thus, to the author of Ephesians, Christ's reign is effective and legitimate in both earthly and spiritual planes. Nevertheless, Ephesians' notion of divine or vice regency deviates from common Greco-Roman Jewish concept of the divine warrior king. Instead of Christ preparing himself in armor to fight celestial and or worldly foes, the congregants of the church must wear these metaphorical military vestments. Quote, put on the whole armor of God so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil, end quote, Ephesians 6:11. This armor includes a shield, sword, breastplate, and helmet, among other military accoutrements. But if Christ is king, why is he not wearing armor? As one scholar put it, quote, in antiquity, the ideal king was nothing if not victorious, end quote. Military victory was a significant source of legitimacy for ancient kings. According to 1st century CE Roman poet Statius, a sign of divine election was not only blessing with an adequate food supply, but more importantly, triumph in quote-unquote warfare. Indeed, the very foundation of the Pax Romana was military success and supremacy, or as the historian Tacitus put it, bloodshed. In the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature, Yahweh is described on many occasions as having put on armor before battling the forces of chaos or redeeming a forsaken Israel. See specifically Isaiah 59:15-20. The Wisdom of Solomon explicitly notes this, detailing that, quote, the Lord will take his zeal as his whole armor and will arm all creation to repel his enemies, end quote, Wisdom 5:17. Indeed, when Ephesians speaks of putting on the armor of God, should not the author be speaking of Christ, who has valiantly placed all opponents below his feet? The congregational armament of Ephesians 6:10-20 subtly indicates that the author of Ephesians does not adhere to the belief in an imminent eschatological return of Christ. The authentic Paul fervently believed that, quote, the rulers of this age are doomed to perish, end quote, in the parousia, the return of Christ. That's 1 Corinthians 2:6. Those rulers being, according to Richard Horsley, quote, human political actors, the Roman Empire generally, end quote. As the apostle states in Romans 13:11-12, this perishing is coming quickly. Quote, the hour has already come. Our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over and the day is almost here, end quote. In Ephesians, however, Christ no longer must engage in battles against the forces of darkness opposed to the gospel. In fact, Christ, through the Spirit, has worked regenerating congregants who previously followed the quote-unquote rulers of the air, Ephesians 2:2. In other words, the cataclysmic conflict between Christ and evil has seemingly already occurred. The decisive battle has been in the past. While there was no war, Julian Smith notes, there is still bloodshed. Yet, quote, the only bloodshed is that of Christ, end quote, during his crucifixion. Christ is cosmically victorious sans apocalyptical chaos kampf. And now the responsibility of standing firm, Ephesians 6:13-14, against oppositional forces to the gospel lays upon the laity. Moreover, just as Christ's victory occurred in the past, so is salvation a historical event. In Ephesians, quote, this realized eschatology corresponds with the letter's understanding of salvation, where the emphasis is on a salvation which has been already accomplished by the Christ event, end quote. Thus, even the salvific character of the parousia, in which Christ will judge the living, the dead, and especially the present governing authorities, has been historicized. All powers, wherever they may be and whatever they may be, are now beneath Christ's feet, and the salvation of all elect congregants is guaranteed. See especially the language of predestination in this letter, chapter 1 and 2. Thus, what are Jesus believers to do but live a life of normalcy and harmony, thanks to this newfound peace of Christ and implicitly the Roman imperial order of Pax Romana? Thus, what Ephesians illuminates is that the concurrent powers of the earth, Rome first among them, are not to be confronted with any type of actualized or even rhetorical violence from heavens or here on earth. Ephesians 6:12 states, quote, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, end quote. Christ is our peace, claims Ephesians, and he, quote, makes peace in one body through the cross, end quote, Ephesians 2:14-16. As for Harry O'Meyer, quote, the author of Ephesians transforms a Roman ideology of imposed peace as a sign of cessation of hostility to a peace won through the death of Jesus, end quote. Marcus Borg and J.D. Crossan further elaborate on the notion of peace between the writing of the authentic Paul, which they argue is diametrically opposed to that which is promoted by Rome. To them, imperial peace is when all is quiet and orderly, while Pauline Christianity promotes a peace when all is fair and just. But Ephesians effectively collapses the two. The Pauline hope of a divinely sanctioned overturning of impressive imperial powers and the restoration of creation itself, see 1 Thessalonians 5 and Romans 8:18-23, is dashed in Ephesians, replaced by a realized eschatology of the past, which may be just considered a theology of pacification. Christians do not fight actively against wickedness, but merely withstand, stand firm, prevail. These are the languages and verbs that are used in Ephesians 6:13. Against what? Idolatrous temptation and tempting cosmic entities, which they are able to withstand with the help of God's armor. The rulers of earth are here to stay, and in fact, their peace to Ephesians in no way counters the gospel of Christ. What does counter Christ's proclamation on earth is the supernatural powers and principalities, evil cosmic forces, and idolatrous temptations, which I mentioned. Much like the authentic Pauline letters of 1 Corinthians, specifically see 1 Corinthians 10:20, Ephesians focuses on the issue of prior and or contemporaneous worship sacrifice to different deities, idols, and spirits. The author of Ephesians sees, quote, pagan deities not as imaginary or lifeless, but powerful and evil emissaries of the devil himself, end quote. One needs the powerful armor of God in order to resist such diabolical wickedness and perhaps the religious cultural allure of paganism itself. Ephesians operates within a worldview common in Hellenized Jewish literature that there existed, quote, a reality of evil spirit beings, end quote. In fact, the author of Ephesians does not in any way demythologize this occultic influence within the epistle, but instead reaffirms the relationship of the devil with other forms of sin, such as the flesh. As scholar Clinton Ardell notes, quote, the flesh and the devil with his powers works in confluence, leading humanity into disobedience with God, end quote. To Ephesians, therefore, the only forces working against the peaceful harmony of the contemporary church are supernatural, unseen forces working in collaboration with the ghouls of paganism and other personified deadly sins. The totalizing, pervasive political structure of domination embodied by Roman imperial rule is passed over in silence. The issues of this earth are either irrelevant, solvable by application of proper household codes, interpersonal relationships that are elaborated within the letter, or mere misunderstanding of the root cause of the issue. It is not Rome's unequal or unjust imperial system that results in personal and or collective suffering or poverty, but rather the forces of evil lurking in the realm of the air. Thanks to the Pax Romana, the only conflict a Jesus follower, believer, has to face is spiritual, for there are no longer necessarily battles occurring between cities and states. However, it is true that the Ephesians metaphor of a Christian decorated in military garb is not novel to the epistle. In 1 Thessalonians 5:8, Paul urges his audience to, quote, put on the breastplate of faith and love and a helmet, the hope of salvation. Also see Romans 6:13-23. Yet what differentiates the urging of the authentic Paul and the author of Ephesians is the purpose and nature of the armor. In 1 Thessalonians, putting on the armor is a matter of supernaturally, if not bodily, protecting oneself for the imminent return of Christ, in which the cosmic conflict involves both spiritual and physical realms. The imagery Paul utilizes in 1 Thessalonians is also typological. The frequent citation to Hebrew scriptures in 1 Thessalonians and beyond, which depicts the day of the Lord, referenced frequently in the minor and major prophets of the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. This event is brutal and earth-shattering. It persuades a reader to believe that Paul himself thought a similar, violent, earth-shattering occurrence was to apocalyptically unfold when Christ's return. Ephesians lacks any such language. Truly, in the latter letter, the armor is practically unnecessary. Christ in Ephesians, especially 1:20-22, is already declared victorious over diabolic powers afflicting the church. Christ is not a divine warrior, but an ideal king who in Ephesians 2:14-17 is portrayed as a peacemaker par excellence. The armor of God is not a means for kingly or corporate protection for an imminent eschaton or global divine conflict. Instead, Ephesians constructs it as mere personal practice against the persuasion of false worship. In conclusion, Ephesians is de-eschatologicalization, I apologize for that word, and supernaturalization of the early Jesus movement experience demonstrates the means by which the text depoliticizes the Pauline tradition, accommodating thought, theology, and behavior away from direct confrontation or even acknowledgement of Rome. God's armor thus becomes a metaphorical invocation of personal struggle with contemporaneous idolatrous practice and belief, and those idols being agents of the devil. The enemies of the church and its gospel have become supernaturalized forces that have no actual bearing on the course of human events. They have already been defeated by Christ the King, and individual salvation of the believer is guaranteed through predestination. Now, there should only be harmony amongst members of the church and household, a harmony that reflects this hierarchical, patriarchal household code of the Roman paterfamilias, Ephesians 5:22-6-9. The question becomes, are Christians still to proclaim justice, righteousness, peace, and deliverance? Well, in Ephesians, justice is within the household. Peace rules both the earth and heavenly realms under Christ's authority. Salvation is a historical fact. Thus, Ephesians not only depoliticizes Paul's eschatological message and supernaturalizes Christian opponents or opponents of Christianity, but promotes a religion of normalcy, passivity, and accommodation. The only issue to watch closely for are the spiritual forces of evil temptation. Ephesians seems to turn Christian eyes away from the horrors of Rome to desperately having them try to find and resist demons in the air. Yet, it is problematic to classify early Christian texts like Ephesians as wholly pro-Roman or in contradistinction, 1 Corinthians and Thessalonians as purely anti-Roman. Indeed, early Christian writers and communities engaged in negotiating their own communal and theological identities with various manifestations of Roman imperial power that surrounded and submerged them. While some scholars, such as Stephen J. Gaudet, rightly claim Ephesians represents a fundamental inversion of the utopian hope that pervades the authentic Paul's writings, these assertions converge on being simplistic and ignore the essential hybridity that existed within these communities, a complex mixture of ideological and theological affirmations, negations, and ambivalences that sought contextual ends for persons and collectives. In Ephesians, while the presentation of Christ is not a divine warrior in line with Roman and Jewish traditions, he is still portrayed as a king nonetheless, who has achieved victory, if in the past. Christians throughout the apostolic and patristic age, while not directly engaging in rebellion against Rome, would be clear and adamant that they worshiped only Christ and never the reigning Caesar. While Ephesians, quote, nowhere explicitly condemns Roman rule or lays out an alternative political vision, end quote, the letter nonetheless is still representative of an early Christian tradition that explicitly confirmed the kingship and lordship of a resurrected Jesus, who, to them, possessed authority over all sovereignties and powers. Thank you very much.
Jackson, thank you. That was very, very interesting. I have a question. If anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat. Otherwise, after my question, we'll be moving on to our next presenter. What is eschatology?
Well, eschatology is merely the study or recognition of the end of the world. That eschatology discusses last things. That's what it refers to. In theology, eschatology can either refer to personal eschatology, what will be the state of an individual after their death, or it can refer to the end of the world. So when we speak of eschatology or de-eschatologicalization, as I apologize for, what I'm referring to is that Ephesians does not include apocalyptic discourse within its letter. So eschatology refers to the end of the world, yes.
Thank you very much. We do have one question for you from the audience before we move on, asking if it is hard to quantify pro-Roman stances on a spectrum between appeasement and full-on de-escalation.
Yes, and I mentioned this with hybridity at the end. It's incredibly complex and impossible to put on a spectrum that you are either fully in line with the Roman system or fully against it. Even seemingly the most accommodative letters of the New Testament, the pastorals, for example, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and we could also say Ephesians, have elements implicitly that resist a full-blown accommodation or support to the Roman system. And so I would say that there's no way to quantify, but through exegetical analysis, through utilizing hermeneutics such as imperial biblical criticism and post-colonialism and feminism and the variety of different marginal hermeneutics of the margins that have arisen over the past 50 years, we can really see the ways in which texts do lend rhetorical or ideological support to imperial systems of domination. And we can also see, too, the ways in which texts that may have appeared apolitical actually are very radical in their affirmation of differing political alternatives and orientations and different ways of structuring communities, et cetera. I think the work of individuals like Richard Horsley and Neil Elliott, who have been very influential in my writing, especially with Horsley, who I quote several times in that work, definitely have shown the ways in which we can read the New Testament with a focus on how it reflects or counters or supports Rome and empire more generally.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I know I said that was the last question, but surprise, we've had a couple more.
I love questions.
And we still have a couple of minutes before we're supposed to move on, so we can have a go at them. What dates would you give to Ephesians, before or after the temple destruction?
Now, see, that is extremely difficult and contentious. I know that there are some who discuss it before the temple. I think probably not. I think Ephesians most likely written towards the end of the 1st century. Now, how that impacts the letter and how that impacts its orientation It's very well possible that Ephesians, written in light of the temple's destruction, wants to cool down on some of the more radical elements of Paul, and some of those elements that I do believe led to his martyrdom. But I think regardless of when it was written, the arguments that I outline in the paper still apply. I think they're flexible enough to apply to whatever kind of context it was written in with regards to the early Jesus movement's relationship and Judaism's relationship to the Roman Empire.
Thank you. And can we compare the theology of Irenaeus and Ephesians?
Can we compare the theology of Irenaeus and Ephesians? I am not as familiar with Ephesians as I would like to be, but Irenaeus, if I remember correctly, does quote Ephesians and seems to utilize it within his Against Heresies. So I think definitely that the early apostolic and early patristic writers